In the modern day world, the topic and discussion of transgender people is controversial. A lot of people feel uncomfortable to talk about it. But why is that? To a lot of people who aren't transgender, they believe it to be a new thing. People label being trans a trend. Others label it a mental illness. But what does it mean to be transgender, and how can we understand it better? It's a difficult topic, a new one for a lot of people to understand and fully grasp. We asked some people at our college to see if they had an understanding, and if they knew any trans people themselves. Do you know any transgender people personally?
I do.
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do. Yes.
No, not personally.
Yes.
Do you understand what being transgender is?
Yes, I understand what it physically is, yes. Yeah.
Not exactly, but I think I have an idea about it.
Yes, I do.
Explain it.
When you feel like you're born in the wrong body and you want to transition between genders.
Basically, to me, it's like when you don't feel comfortable in kind of the body you're born with.
It's when... Give me a second just to think of the right words.
I think it's like when you're not okay with like the identity you're given, so you kind of like shift and make do. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't want to sound offensive.
As you can see, a lot of people struggled with answering, and I can understand. It's definitely not easy to answer. Thankfully, for the people who are confused and can't come up with a straightforward answer, the American Psychological Association has a pretty good, up-to-date explanation. They define being transgender as an umbrella term for people whose gender identity, expression, and behaviour does not conform to the sex they were assigned with at birth. To simplify it, a transgender woman may have been born a man, which would be said as assigned male at birth, but does not align with that and instead identifies as a woman. But people don't fully identify with either of the two, as it doesn't feel right to be all left or all right. Some people feel more comfortable sitting in the middle, and that's okay. To help explain this further, we have to remember that people are identified by the sex they are born with. Sex is what you are physically given, your genitalia, for example, but you may not feel like those really represent who you are. This is where gender steps in. Gender is what you more align with. To a lot of people, you're comfortable with your sex, so your gender is the same. To separate that from trans people, you would be called cisgender, as in staying the same, as that's what the scientific definition of it is. To others, to trans people, you may not be comfortable with your body, your features, so you try and make yourself more comfortable by aligning yourself to what gender you associate with. Or you are comfortable with both, so you identify with both gender characteristics. Transgender people have been around for longer than you might think, and they've helped do so much in the world despite you never knowing who they were. Throughout this short documentary, we're going to explore the history of transgender people, the attempted ignorance and erasure of us, and why visibility and support of our community is such an important thing. This discussion has existed for thousands of years, as early civilization and cultures have considered the differences between sex and gender. In ancient China, they had the eunuchs, which were assigned male at birth people who were castrated and given the job to protect women's living areas in court. They existed in China since 4,000 years ago, were imperial servants 3,000 years ago, and were common as civil servants by the time of the Qing dynasty until a century ago. They've sometimes been viewed as a third sex, or a transgender practice, and emperors often viewed eunuchs as women. Cross-gender behaviour has long been common in Chinese theatre, especially in feminine-led roles. Today, Jin Xing is a well-known entertainer and trans woman. Ancient Egypt had third gender categories, including the eunuchs. Mut, Sekhmet, and other goddesses are sometimes represented androgynously, and Anat wears both masculine and feminine clothing. As different cultures and societies solidified its ideas of the world, a lot of them restricted ideas of gender and sex. Fortunately, during the early 20th centuries, Germany experienced a cultural shift that allowed trans people to start expressing themselves. Magnus Hirschfeld was a Jewish physician and sexologist and was an early advocate of sexual and gender studies in the 1910s through 1930s. Originally, Hirschfeld dedicated his work to natural remedies and preventative medicine. However, he soon dedicated his efforts towards understanding sexuality and gender. It is unclear what made him decide this, but one reason could be to understand his own sexuality. Hirschfeld never publicly disclosed his sexuality or personal life to the public, though his long-term relationship with Carl Gieser would later become well known. At the time, there wasn't a great understanding towards sex, gender, and sexuality, but Hirschfeld led a powerful breakthrough into the subjects during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His work was part of an emerging cultural shift in Germany, as discussions of sexuality opened up and were studied more closely. Hirschfeld became a more noticed figure during the Weimar Republic. Not only did he dedicate his time to research, but he used that research in producing pamphlets, books, journals, all specified to reach the public, scholars, and medical professionals in hopes they'll understand. Hirschfeld was a supporter of transgender patients, offering them counselling as they explored themselves. He developed special passes to protect trans people from the police, so they couldn't be harassed or arrested. Unfortunately, Hirschfeld's efforts would come to a close as the Nazi Party grew to power. The Nazis were openly disrespectful and hateful towards the understanding and research of gender and sexuality, and some of this hate would become directed towards Hirschfeld's work. Soon enough, the Nazi takeover would lead to a lot of Hirschfeld's work being destroyed. Hirschfeld was targeted by the Nazis for being Jewish and gay. It's believed that if a lot of his work was still intact today, we would be decades ahead in understanding sex, gender, and sexuality. The gay rights movement started gaining traction during that time, and they still pushed forward even after the difficulties of World War II. Transgender people have been an integral part of the gay rights movement. They have been at the forefront of many of its activism efforts, and played a significant role in raising awareness about the discrimination and marginalisation that transgender individuals face. They have also been instrumental in pushing for inclusive policies and laws that protect the rights of all members in the LGBTQ+ community. Since America's early days of the movement, transgender people like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Miss Major Griffin Gracie were heavily involved. Johnson and Rivera joined together to form the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, made to help protect the sex-working or homeless queer youth who were being disproportionately affected. Despite their strong support, 50 years later, transgender people of colour still face intense discrimination. In the modern day, the transgender movement has become so popular and is so politically involved. The movement is kicked about, mocked, shamed. Leah Thomas is an American swimmer who recently came out as a transgender woman. She recently won the top trophy in University Women's 500-yard freestyle race. She has been verbally attacked by sports stars, politicians, activists, and even the parents of some of her teammates, who argued that her time as a man gives her an unfair advantage. Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis has signed a proclamation declaring Emma Wyant, the runner-up who is a cis woman, the rightful winner. The Independent did their own research into this and found that compared to other women at her level, Leah poses little threat to women's sports. It's difficult for people to respect us, and I wanted to speak with somebody who has experienced this side of the fight. That's why I interviewed Katie Neves, a local activist here in Leicester. So, the first question I want to ask is, alongside activism, what are other ways that can help make people more aware of trans information?
There are many strands to activism, and when you say the word activist, you tend to think of the angry placard wavers, and there's a place for that, and I've done my fair share of angry placard waving, so that's fine. But I try to approach this much more positively because I think you can reach more people that way. So I think visibility is just so important. I think it's everything really. So and what I do, so I do trans awareness training and inspirational speaking. So often I'm brought in as could be an after dinner speaker or as an inspirational speaker at a conference. And what I do is I tell my story, but in an entertaining way. So I use a lot of humour, and I think it's vital to do that, because if you can make people laugh, then they'll like you, they'll listen to what you've got to say, and they'll understand it and they'll remember it. And I think that's so important. You know, if you can reach out to people that way, you'll get far more people, and just to understand that we're just ordinary people. We don't transition to be somebody who we're not. We transition in order to be happy from a place of being deeply unhappy. But I think if you're angry all the time, people just switch off, and then they just judge you as an angry person, and then you become an irrelevance. Whereas if they actually like you and then they engage with you and think, oh yeah, she's funny, and then they realise, yeah, oh yeah, we're just ordinary people. Then they can just chill their beans, then, can't they?
Have you learned anything from younger trans people that you didn't know before?
I've learned quite a lot from younger trans people, to be honest. I used to think that it was the younger generation that just got it, and that was it, and it was the older generation that needed the education about trans people. But then I started doing some work for some Pride youth groups, and so I started talking to young trans people and to all LGBTQIA+ people. And it was really interesting because then they told me that there's a lot of both homophobic and transphobic bullying that goes on in schools, particularly secondary schools. And so there's an awful lot of education that needs doing there as well, which I didn't think that there was until I spoke to these young people. So they really opened my eyes to the struggles that they have. And I think also talking to young people as well, I've got lots of friends who've got trans children, some quite young trans children, and just seeing that, how much they're struggling with it. I mean, their gender dysphoria was much greater than mine was. I mean, I struggled with it all my life, but to a lesser extent than they have, because it was so strong for them that they need to transition at a much younger age. For me, I fought against it for 48 years before finally admitting to myself I'm trans, and I'm so much happier now. And I look back and think, well, actually, how would have life been so different if I'd been able to have transitioned earlier? But I can't turn the clock back. And it's fine. It's fine. I'm happy with my life because I'm really happy now, and I can just see how much happier these kids are now when they're living their truth. It's amazing to see. Well, the thing is, there's a lot of misinformation and hate put out on social media, in the mainstream media, and also in Parliament. So there is so much out there, and so it has to be countered. It's tiring having to keep constantly doing that, and so often when I'm brought into interviews, I do interviews on radio and television and stuff like that. So often, the only time people want me in is when they want me to justify my existence, and then they want me to have an argument with somebody who's trans hostile, and it's just tiring, and I shouldn't have to do that. And what I say to them is that, would you do that if you were doing a piece about race, for instance? Would you get someone in from the BNP to have an argument with somebody who's black? I would hope they wouldn't. But it's the same sort of thing, because my identity isn't up for debate. It's my identity, it's who I am. A lot of trans people do end up with mental issues just because of the pressure that's put on them by society, and the pressure that they end up therefore putting on themselves. I mean, I put a lot of pressure on myself to try and conform to be somebody who I thought people wanted me to be, and it took me 48 years to realise that nobody else gives a stuff. And what actually people do respond to is authenticity, and if you can be your authentic self, then people really respond really well to that.
Do you think information on trans people has become more widely available, leading to younger people becoming more aware of themselves?
I do think that information on trans people has become more widely available. I think just with the growth of social media, it's just so accessible, and people are able to have a voice now that previously wouldn't be able to, because certainly on the mainstream media, trans people so often don't get a voice, and if we do, it's only when it's to have an argument against a trans hostile person. But on social media, you can have a voice because you can just do it yourself, and especially with stuff like TikTok that a lot of young people are using, you can really tell your story with that, and you can put stuff out on YouTube or whatever, and that's what I've been doing. So I've been vlogging my whole journey. I get contacted all the time by other trans people and parents of trans people and partners of trans people, and so often they can be struggling, but then they sort of say that watching my videos has really helped them, and it really helped their transition, and so often they don't contact me until a few years down the line, but it's great to be able to help them like that, and other people are doing this. It's not just me that's doing this, lots of other people are doing it as well, but it really does help, and it just shows that they're not alone. It really gave me a boost, and I think that's more of that is needed. So the more visibility, the better, just to show that we are just ordinary people.
Like Katie said, we are just people. Like you, we just want to feel safe, comfortable and happy. Our lives are short, but we have such an impact on the world and what we leave behind. Should the next generation go on to repeat our actions, or should we engage with what's becoming more acceptable? Should we better ourselves and learn to love everyone for their differences?